Hey guys, and welcome. This video is going to be a little bit different due to the fact we are discussing user interfaces and how personal they are. This isn't really a video that could be scripted. So without any further delay, let's get to the main screens and let's discuss how UIs are created, why they're so personal, and touch briefly on add-ons and kind of any recommendations I have going forward. So, for those of you that do or don't know, I play on a widescreen monitor. So, this is effectively the native view that I'd have. But if I condense everything down to fit within a YouTube video or if I'm streaming, you obviously end up with these two black banners. In the past, in old videos, I have attempted to fill these banners up with a graphic or something in order to keep them engaged while still allowing people to see the whole of my screen. However, that came into causing some friction, effectively, and it seems a little bit zoomed out compared to what I'm seeing visually. So we transitioned to essentially zooming in on the character, and this is Oracrypt. I'd like to introduce you my Legion Warlock, Legion Remix Warlock, I should say, that has come to the forefront and will be a mainstay of the channel, and has been the individual that you've seen in some of our videos already when I did the State of Warlock. But, his introduction aside, because we are deliberately trying to create a user interface that works for streaming and YouTube content, I have to kind of centralize everything within a 1080p. And as a result of that, we have some interesting little quirks. So, bouncing back to the main recording screen, like zoomed out, you can see that my chat bar is far to the left, bottom left. But if I zoom in, it's not visible at all. This means I don't necessarily need to worry about a chat panel or using my face cam in order to hide text. Now, this isn't to say that there's stuff that shouldn't be shown, like, guild chat or party chat or whatever, but it does enable some level of privacy for friends and things like that that don't necessarily like being recorded as much. So it's a nice little perk of the job. However, it does mean we run into a constraint where when we hit edit mode, we kind of need everything boxed in. So to put it in, like, this is what you guys see, and this is what I'm staring at. As you can see, there are huge swaths of screen that just don't have anything at all, which is fine. Like, it works, but there needs to be that concession. Obviously, if you're playing on a 1080p monitor and everything's kind of condensed, you don't necessarily need to worry about it as much. Now, for those of you that are relatively new to the game or are new to the idea of making UIs, a little bit of psychology 101 and how your brain works. Whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent, functionally your eyes are the same. Your screen can be broken down into 3, potentially 4 segments, depending on where you're gaining this information from. But generally speaking, the center of your screen, you can consider there being a box. Now, for the purposes of this, we are going to use my chat frame as the box, and we are going to extend it out somewhat. So effectively, this, where we have the chat frame, is what's considered priority information. This is what your eye naturally gravitates towards and is depicted by this rather small, forgive me if you might not be able to see it, but there is a purple crosshair in the center of the screen. Effectively, it zones in on your character's head, like the back of your character's head in game. And this is kind of the main information that you would need to process. This obviously goes to the top of the screen and all the way down, because you then have your secondary zones still within a default line of sight. Then you have your B zone, it's still good territory to have things in, but it's not as prevalent because you might need to flick your eyes away from something that's happening directly under your character for a moment to understand it. This is where we start getting into the territory. Let's just revert this back. Revert all changes. Put my chat bar back to where it belongs. But this is where you end up with the ability timeline, boss and arena health, buffs, minimap, and also party frames. Now, raid frames can also sit to the side somewhat. You can move it over here. If you're a DPS player and you don't necessarily need to worry about combat reses and the like. However, having formerly been a healer for a period of time and having friends that are healers, I like to have that information to hand, especially when it comes to a raid environment if I need to combat res someone. It also gives me a good idea of how the raid is performing as we're going through and whether or not there's chances of a raid like wipe being called. Party chat or party frames, again, very similar. Not necessarily something that you need to have your eyes on 100% of the time because I'm not a healer, but I do need it relatively close to the foreground where it comes to my vision, because as a warlock, if I'm playing affliction or destruction, I might be using my imp rather than a fell hunter, which means that being able to dispel a target comes in handy. Situations through the War Within expansion were things like Cinderbrew Meadery. IPA, the boss there, had quite a nasty debuff, and being a warlock, swapping to my imp for that fight because there was nothing to kick, meant that I was instantly able to dispel myself, or if it wasn't on me, I could assist the healer in dispelling the party and massively reduce the damage that was taken. Therefore, having this information to hand is useful. However, if you're playing a warrior, or something that has no real class utility in terms of interacting with the party outside of congratulations, I've shouted or I've stunned something, then you don't necessarily need to worry about party, and you can move it even further out into one of the relegated zones. Now, with that in mind, and we'll just revert the changes again, because I obviously have mine set out like this, you can see that there are a few add-ons I have prevalent or showcased on my screen. Now, these add-ons are bare bones. They're fairly basic. I have a couple that will interact with the main UI. So I have Baginator and Syndicator to help with inventory, because I prefer them over the default bags. The reason for this is because something like Baginator or Addy Bags or, any of the inventory add-ons out there is it will separate incoming items for me to sort easier later. Now, in the case of Overcrypt, having been a Legion Remix character, he doesn't really have overwhelming bags. He hasn't filled them full of crap yet, which is great going into midnight, but it means I don't really have anything to show you here. But things like armor, weapons, consumables would all get categorized here. It's very, very handy to have. Usually it sits off screen, quite literally just sits off screen with the size of it, as you can see, because end of the day, we don't really need to worry about that information a lot. But on the topic of that, I do also have this Blizzard Move add-on. Now, this is absolutely amazing, because if I hit my character panel, I'll discuss why my character panel looks the way it does, but you can see it's already off to one center, because the default place to put this is to the far left. Now, obviously, if I open up my social at the same time, it does move it across, which would put it in frame for streaming or recording. But that's not always a great workaround. But with Move Anything, or Blizz Move, we are able to literally drag it to wherever we want, which means I can drag it into the center of the screen, and it can be a main talking point, which leads onto why does my character screen look like this rather than the default UI, and that's because I'm using an add-on called Chunky Character Sheet. Now, there is also a better character panel as an add-on that both functionally work the same in terms of the actual gear list itself. Because what they'll do is it'll highlight missing enchants, missing sockets, and allow you to keep on top of gear maintenance. However, Chunky Character Sheet then becomes a little bit different because it highlights attributes, secondaries, and just makes it nice and colourful, but also gives you the opportunity to track both your raid progress. So if we move it slightly further to the left so that you guys can see, when I hover open, it'll open up the midnight raid progress sheets as we go through, and also allows for the tracking of M+ straight off the bat. You can also shift it over and have your character like this if you prefer to admire your transmog a little bit more without having all the text crunch it. If we go into the settings, the Chunky Character Sheet, you can also go down to stat settings, and if you're new to a class and playing and want to use Wowhead as a starting point, you can see here that the secondary stats are in its default configuration of crit, haste, mastery, and versatility. However, if you select Show Wowhead Recommended Stats, you'll see that they get prioritized in a different order. So, crit, haste, mastery, and verse. Both crit and haste are equal in value, according to Wowhead's guides, and mastery and versatility then come up second for Demonology Warlocks. Obviously, if I swap to Affliction or Destruction, those stats will change, and it kind of gives you a starting guide on where to push gearing. Obviously, when we go into Midnight, I'll make videos that discuss gearing then, and we can discuss why stat priorities get a little bit sketchy. But it's a good starting point if you're new to the class. Now, with that said, when it comes to add-ons, there's a bit of an elephant in the room. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are sick and tired to death of hearing of the Weak or Armageddon and the add-on apocalypse and stuff. And I'm not really going to reiterate those points or things. The only thing I will say is, going forward, Blizzard has a stance on their default UI becoming more universally accepted. They want their default UI to have all these bells and whistles within a certain element. A good example of this is the default. If we go into options and gameplay enhancements and scroll down, they do have an external damage meter, as you can see here. We will edit mode it slightly and just bring it up here for a second. Just put it out of the way. Now, actually, what we'll do is we'll do this so it can have its own centered bit for a moment. Just put the party chat there. We will save temporarily, and I'll just revert everything back after this video. But if we close it down, Details has had its ability to read in-combat data massively restricted. If we go to the add-ons and scroll up to Details, nope, yep. Correction, we got to scroll down. You can see that Encounter Breakdown, Raid Check, Storage, Streamer, Tiny Thread, and Vanguard are now incompatible. So, the ability to track what buttons I'm pressing as we go through things and dynamically update is a bit of a problem. However, it is still going to be considered better than what the default Blizzard's damage breakdown can do due to the limitations that the meter currently has. So, you've got damage options, DPS. They've recently added the damage taken window, and this is a recent addition. It's only been out for a week, 2 weeks at most at this point. But it shows that they are continuing to iterate on it. One of the other issues is if we go into settings and go, actually, is it? Create new window. Here it is. So you end up creating a second window. But if you go into edit mode, although this can be dragged around freely, the base version still kind of sucks. And although you can have overall and close that down for a second, close that back, just so we can thing. You can change from overall to current segment, and you could have damage in one, DPS in the other, and you can have a very similar setup or layout to what I have in details here. But the problem comes into the fact that, as you can already tell, they're not locking together. So they are edited individually, which is not great. Now, obviously, we can delete this window and go back to having just the one, or, for the time being at least, we can still use details. But the damage window itself kind of shows that case of Blizzard intend to continue iterating. Now, why have I waffled about this? Some content creators out there are still creating UIs that have considerable add-ons as part of the toolkit. They are trying to replicate pre-midnight UIs, effectively, despite the restrictions. It's effectively trying to, or it seems to me, and by all means, comment below if you disagree. I'm really interested in people's takes on the kind of add-on stance going forward and how to address it. Because end of the day, it's processing information. So disagree with this hot take if you like. I'd love to hear about it. But they're effectively trying to... Blizzard have come out with a stance, and players are effectively trying to circumvent it in their own creative ways. Which brings us to the problem that was things like private auras and fights turning into hellscapes where your first raid night on a progression boss was actually just sat dealing with weak auras. Because effectively you'd try and code the fight to play itself as much as feasibly possible. And Blizzard don't want that. They want the information to be universal and for the game itself to naturally provide that information for you. So you could download 1,000,001 add-ons to try and retain an old UI, or you can download individual add-ons that assist you where you need it most, where you're having the sticking points. So you don't quite like the default damage meters, there's details. And you can reskin elements here and there. Now, personally, I'm on the stance of try to use the native or the default UI as much as possible. The reason for this is because if going forward Blizzard continue to adapt and change the API and more add-ons break, you reduce the risk of being in a position where something like LVOI, for instance, is still buggy weeks after it's apparently been updated for the new content and for the new restrictions. Now, massive respect to LVOI, I used to use it myself, but patch days were always notorious for something breaking in it. And there are collection add-ons out there, like Quality of Life at the moment, that has a huge string of add-ons in that, as the name suggests, improve your quality of life in the game. The issue is whether or not something within that add-on breaks and it causes a chain reaction of Lua errors that will just stress you out post-patch day or post-expansion launch. Whereas if you have individual add-ons that you've kind of gone, actually, yeah, you know what, I could really do with this add-on on top, like I have the Blizz moving, or the ability to move Blizzard's frames, and I've got like Angry Keystones because I prefer that format, Jesus Christ, to the default version. But if it breaks, I can quickly disable it, and yeah, okay, it's a minor inconvenience, but it means I can still have, say, 80% of the add-ons and slight improvements here and there. So like you can see that my UI, for the most part, is default now. So I run into very few problems. And my overall performance as well is generally pretty smooth. You can see that my average CPU usage is nothing, my peak CPU is a little bit higher because I was in Donegal, and my frame rate's not too shabby. The add-on memory details is taking up the most, with BTW quests coming in after that. Now, BTW quests is not something you have to download. It is purely a thing for me because my partner is playing or starting to play World of Warcraft, and we're going to go do Lawmaster. So this particular add-on takes up a huge amount of resources, but is a temporary measure while we go enjoy old content. Now, hopefully this video has helped. I appreciate we're starting to ramble a bit, but that was kind of the risk of not scripting like we have with the prior videos. Comment below if this has helped you in any way, shape, or form, and I will see you all in the next one. Take care, folks, and have a good day.